Persephone glared at the monster as she entered a smaller, smoky room. Unlike the main floor of the club, this space was intimate and quiet. Over her, there was a single large chandelier that provided enough light to illuminate tables and faces, but not much else. There were several clusters of people gathered, playing cards, and none of them seemed to notice her. When the door clicked shut behind her, she started to explore, looking for Lexa, but found herself distracted by the people and the games. She watched his graceful hands dispense cards and listened as players at the table bantered back and forth. Then she came to an oval table where the occupants were leaving. She wasn't sure what drew her to it, but she decided to sit. The dealer nodded.
"Madam, do you play?"
A voice asked from behind her. It was a deep rumble she felt in her chest. She turned and met a pair of endless eyes. The man from the balcony stood in her shadow. Her blood heated to an unbearable level, making her flush. She squeezed her crossed legs together and clenched her hands into fists to keep from fidgeting under his gaze. Up close, she was able to fill in a few gaps in her assessment of his appearance. He was beautiful in a dark way, in a way that promised heartbreak. His eyes were the color of obsidian and framed by thick lashes. His hair pulled into a bun at the back of his head. She had been right that he was tall. She had to tip her head back just to meet his gaze. When Persephone's chest started to ache, she realized she had been holding her breath since the man approached. Slowly she drew in air, and with it the smell of him. Smoke and spice and winter air. It filled every empty place inside of her. As she stared, he took a sip from his glass, licking his lips clean. He was sin incarnate. She could feel it in the way her body responded to his. And she didn't want him to know, so she smiled and said, "I'm willing to play if you're willing to teach." His lips quirked, and he raised a dark brow. He took another drink, then approached the table, taking a seat beside her.
"It's brave to sit down at a table without knowing the game."
She met the man's gaze. "How else would I learn?" He considered, and Persephone decided she loved his voice.
"Clever."
The man stared like he was trying to place her, and she shivered.
"I've never seen you before."
"Well, I've never been here before," she said and paused. "You must come here often." His lips quirked.
"I do."
"Why?" she asked. Persephone was surprised she said that aloud, and so was the man. His brows rose. She tried to cover. "I mean, you don't have to answer that."
"I will answer it, if you will answer a question for me."
She stared at him for a moment, then nodded. "Fine."
"I come because it is fun."
He said, but it didn't sound like he knew what that meant.
"Now you. Why are you here tonight?"
"My friend Lexa was on the list," she said.
No. That is the answer to a different question. Why are you here tonight?
She considered his question, then said, "It seemed rebellious at the time."
And now you aren't so sure.
"Oh, I am sure it's rebellious." Persephone dragged her fingers along the surface of the table. "I'm just not sure how I'll feel about it tomorrow."
Who are you rebelling against?
She looked at him and smiled. "You said one question." His smirk matched hers, and it made her heart beat harder in her chest.
So I did.
Staring back at those endless eyes, she felt he could see her. Not the glamour or even her skin and bones, but the core of her, and it made her shiver.
Are you cold?
He asked. "What?"
You've been shivering since you sat down.
She felt her face redden. "Who was that woman with you earlier?" Confusion clouded his face and then cleared.
Oh, Mente. She's always putting her hands where they don't belong.
Persephone paled. Minthie sounded like a mistress, and if that was the case, she wasn't interested. I think I should go. He stopped her with a hand on hers. His touch was electric and warmed her from the inside out. She pulled away quickly.
No,
He said, almost commanding, and Persephone glared at him. Excuse me?
what I mean to say is, I haven't taught you how to play yet.
His voice lowered to a mesmerizing rumble.
Allow me.
It was a mistake to hold his gaze, because it was impossible to say no when she did. She swallowed and managed to relax. Then teach me. His eyes burned into her before falling to the cards. He shuffled them, explaining.
This is poker.
She noted that he had graceful hands and long fingers. Did he play piano?
We will play a 5-card draw, and we'll start with a bet.
Persephone looked down at herself. She hadn't bought her clutch, but the man was quick to say.
The question answered then. If I win, you will answer any question I pose. If you win, I will answer yours.
Persephone grimaced. She knew what he was going to ask, but answering questions was far better than losing all her money and her soul. So she said, Deal. Those sensual lips curled into a smile, which deepened the lines on his face that only made him look more attractive. Who was this man? She guessed she could ask his name, but she wasn't interested in making friends that never night. While dealing each of them 5 cards, the man explained that in poker, there were 10 different rankings, the lowest being high cards and the highest being the royal flush. The goal was to draw a higher rank than the other player. He explained other things like checking, folding, and bluffing. Bluffing? Persephone echoed.
Sometimes poker is just a game of deception, especially when you're losing.
Persephone looked at her hand and tried to remember what he said about the different ranks. She laid her cards down face up, and the man did the same.
You have a pair of queens,
He said.
and I have a full house.
So you win, she said.
Yes.
He replied and claimed his prize immediately.
Who are you rebelling against?
She smiled wryly. My mother. He raised a brow.
Why?
You have to win another hand if I'm going to answer. He dealt another and won again. This time, he didn't ask the question, just looked at her expectantly. She sighed. Because she made me mad. He stared at her, waiting. She smiled. You never said the answer had to be detailed. His grin matched hers.
Noted for the future, I assure you.
The future?
Well, I hope this isn't the last time we'll play poker.
Butterflies erupted in her stomach. She should tell him this was the first and final time she would come to Nevernight. Except, she couldn't make herself say the words. He dealt again, and won. Persephone was getting tired of losing and answering this man's questions. Why was he so interested in her anyway? Where was the woman he'd been with earlier?
Why are you angry with your mother?
She considered this question for a moment. She wants me to be something I can't. Persephone dropped her gaze to her cards. I don't understand why people do this. He tilted his head.
You're not enjoying our game?
I am, but I don't understand why people play Hades. Why do they want to sell their soul to him?
They don't agree to a game because they want to sell their soul.
He said.
They do it because they think they can win.
Do they? When?
Sometimes.
Does that anger him, you think? The question was meant to remain a thought in her head, and yet the words slipped out between her lips. He smirked and she could feel it deep in her gut.
Darling, I win either way.
Her eyes went wide, and her heart stuttered. She stood quickly, and his name fell from her mouth like a curse. Hades. His name on her tongue seemed to have an effect on him, but she couldn't tell if it was good or bad. His eyes darkened, and his smile lines melted into a hard, unreadable mask. I have to go. She spun and left the small room. This time she didn't let him stop her. She hurried down the winding steps and plunged into the mass of bodies on the main floor. All the while she was highly aware of the spot on her wrist, where Hades' fingers had touched her skin. Was it an exaggeration to say it burned? It took her a while to find the exit, and when she did, she pushed through the doors. Outside, she took a few deep breaths before hailing a taxi. Climbing inside, she sent a quick text to Lexa, letting her know she was leaving. And while she felt bad, it didn't seem fair to make Lexa leave early just because she couldn't stay in that tower another minute. The force of what she'd done hit her. She allowed Hades, the god of the underworld, to instruct her, touch her, play her, and question her. And he had won. But that wasn't the worst part. No. The worst part was that there was a side of her. A side she never knew existed until tonight. And that wanted to run back inside, find him, and demand a lesson in the anatomy of his body.